These are some of the first scenes that combined, work from multiple visual effects companies as well. And just because of the scale and scope and variety of effects we had in this film, we were using a lot of different visual effects companies sort of all over the world. And in here we have a combination, obviously, of the miniatures, but also a company in Guatemala, Studio C, and Sony Imageworks with the beavers, sort of all combining their work together. Later on, that becomes more and more complex when you have something like Rhythm and Hughes doing a lion, Sony Imageworks doing the beavers and Mr. Tumnus, and then ILM doing the backgrounds and other creatures. And it was, I think, the first time that anything's really been integrated across multiple facilities to that level. And while challenging, it shows an incredible cooperation between these, somewhat competitive facilities.
So warm out. I'll go and check the sleigh.
Yeah, there was a thing again that Roger and I talked very early on about the design of the film, and that was the colour design. To start in kind of the muted sombre tones of London, get in the very high contrast world at the beginning of Narnia, the winter Narnia, to have an explosion of colour with spring, but really hold back gold so that the first real presence of gold comes along with Aslan, and then ultimately to end the film in gold in the seasons of in the autumn season at the end of the children's experience there. And I actually related this experience to one that I had as a child, which is moving from New Zealand to Papua New Guinea. And while New Zealand is very beautiful, it's mostly greens and browns and fairly sort of earthy colours, whereas Papua New Guinea is very tropical and full of the hibiscus flowers and bird of paradise and so on. And I remember that sensation as if, the first day you get colour TV. And I wanted Narnia to feel like that you were contained within this limited colour space for long enough that when spring came, it would feel like a relief and an explosion of colour. And then, of course, we shot it in New Zealand where you had the greens and browns.
Think about whose side you're on.
Now, this is the first time we actually see how those stone creatures came to be?
Yes.
That it is the White Witch herself with that wand who can transform a living creature into a stone creature.
Again, that was one of the things that was revealed earlier in the book, but I felt like I wanted to hold on to the suspense a bit longer to introduce the idea of the stone creatures, and it sort of is obvious that she did something to Mr. Tumnus and that her wand was somehow involved, but you didn't see that. And I did want to kind of slowly build how treacherous she was, how dangerous she was, by kind of seeding it throughout. That first you see the result, then you actually see it happening, and then so when you see her in battle, you understand how powerful she is. This is a location in near Oamaru in the South Island of New Zealand, and it's a place that Simon Riley, our location scout, took me very early on. And we landed there, and it was just one of those very magical places. It was a place that you went to where you immediately started talking in hushed tones. It just had this real majesty to it. And I just fell in love with this and Elephant Rocks, which is just nearby. It's just the giant boulders, and immediately wanted to make it one of the locations, and decided on Aslan's camp.
You're right. When we first walked in there, you talk about hushed tones. You almost felt like you were walking into a cathedral.
Yeah, and interesting enough, this area is called Whalebone because they actually uncovered whale bones here, and yet it's inland in New Zealand. It's a good, I think, a couple 100 miles from the coast.
It's also quite high up, the altitude. So at one point, clearly, probably all of the South Island was underwater.
I think this is a beautiful job of these tents that Roger and his team built. How many did you build in the end?
We built not enough. We figured the army was 5,000, and I think we had less than 100 tents, so we had to multiply them by 30, I think, probably, or something like that in visual effects, CGI.
But I think the fact that these really were sort of real functional tents, and in fact during our sporadic weather we would often take refuge in these tents, really kind of comes through. I think it has real authenticity. This is also sort of an interesting scene because other than the fact that you see Aslan for the first time, it's the first time you see the variety of creatures of Narnia. So this to me is one of the most important shots in the film, and one of the shots that when we set out to make this film I kind of blindly went forth hoping we would be able to achieve by the time we finished, and started developing the technology with Rhythm and Hughes a good year and a half before we started shooting, sort of knowing that if we could pull off a photoreal lion we could do all of the other creatures, and that a photoreal lion was absolutely essential, that he had to have stage presence. It wasn't like Jaws where you could shoot around him. He had to really have screen presence and power and warmth and just be accepted as another character in the film.
You know, interesting, Andrew, I actually think that the next scene with Aslan and Peter on top of the ridge looking at Castle Cair Paravel and having their dialogue is more important, because that's the one that sort of solidifies what we've just seen. It's almost as effective as this scene is. I almost think, you know, can they sustain it? Is this sort of a one-off thing? And I actually feel that the next dialogue is a dialogue between two living, breathing creatures, and it somehow sells the incredible feat of pulling off this photoreal lion.
I know what you mean. I guess I feel like the first shot is kind of like, you know, you only get one chance at a first impression and you've got to get that, but then you do have to carry it through, and you're absolutely right. It's the next scene that he becomes a character.
And look at, there are a couple of shots over his back, and just look at the muscles and the hair on his on his mane, and it is so convincing to me.
The other interesting thing about this scene is this moment coming up here, where we actually had fairly well done with the film a couple of months from finishing, and really found that Aslan needed to be more personable. You know, as I'd sort of said, I wanted to know what he was like on his day off. And humour can buy you a lot. And even though this is not a sort of a rolling in the aisles kind of humour, the fact that he makes a joke makes him more of a real person and then more sympathetic later on. And I had to pour through every take of William that I could find, because this was a very serious and somber scene about William's responsibility, about Peter's responsibility.
Did you say paw through?
Pour through. P-O-U-R. And actually found a take where he was being buzzed by a fly. There was a fly actually flying around his head, and he just, you know, laughed, and it was a genuine smile. And it just made the moment so much more personal and made Aslan so much more likable. This portion of the movie, I think, was the hardest to work out, starting to balance between the children and the fact that they were all separated, and keeping track of Edmund and Peter and the girls all simultaneously.
Do you remember, Roger, that this was a night scene?
No.
We originally shot that for nighttime and ended up moving it earlier.
Oh, I see. Of course you did, yeah.
Yes, the scene at camp seemed too long otherwise. We needed a kind of a break and to touch base with Edmund.
Yeah. It's incredible what you can do nowadays with the post-production, isn't it?
It was very fortunate. I wish I could say I'd planned it that way.
We found with audience this very next moment now is a big surprise for them. And with little kids, it not that it upsets them, but it really does. It's fun to watch them jump in their seats.
Susan!
This moment of Peter and the wolf, so to speak, there was sort of several steps to Peter's development as a hero. The first was that complete reluctance. The second was an instinctual, almost a mistake that saved them on the ice. And this is the first time he relies on his instincts and does something heroic before he becomes a true hero by willingly going into the battle. And there was a time when I contemplated removing some of this, removing the moment when he gets knighted, because it seemed, very similar to being crowned at the end of the film. But somehow, and it's a tribute to C.S. Lewis and the structure of the story, somehow the moment where he gets knighted here is essential to his development as a character. again, some of these, relatively simple scenes become quite complex just because of all the different effects necessary to achieve them. That you've got a centaur that's half man, half horse, and that's sometimes a CG horse and sometimes a real horse with a CG man, and sometimes entirely CG. So every shot ends up involving a different technique. And then, of course, the wolves and the lion and the big cats here are not real. And the satyrs, the goat men, were guys in prosthetic suits with green pants who will replace their legs later. So it really is a mixture of disciplines in every case.
Narnia.
This is when we start to see Peter, played by William Moseley, really start to become a young man. He no longer looks like the little boy at the beginning of the film.
There's also, he was starting to get into his horse training and arms training and all the kind of stuff that he really loved.
He also has proved himself to be quite a physical actor, so not to take away from what he did in dialogue at the beginning of the film, but I think he really feels comfortable moving about and running and comfortable with the sword, and perhaps it's just a young boy's fantasy, but he really came into his own.
This moment is interesting because I had this moment in the script originally of Edmund being rescued, and for budget reasons I actually cut it out. I decided it could all happen off screen and we would know what was going on and the audience would be fine. And every time I screened it, everyone was a little bit confused by that moment and felt like they were missing out on something. So we actually had to repurpose some plates shot for entirely different reasons, and Rhythm and Hughes generated all of the characters within those scenes other than Edmund and Ginnebrick, the dwarf, to actually be able to see a little bit of the rescue, and it just kind of satisfied that sort of hole that seemed to be there in earlier attempts. And then we yet again start to see another side of the witch, which is more of her warrior side.
See, what were you complaining about, all the tents, Roger? Look at them all.
Gorgeous. It looks great, actually. It's a wonderful location.
Edmund!
This image here was one that was very important to me too. Just that so much is communicated just in the animation, and with lack of dialogue, that I think Rhythm Hughes and Richie, the animation supervisor there, just did such a beautiful job of communicating without words, just in body language and facial expression.
And who did the sky? Because I know we altered it.
Yes, the sky was actually a matte painting, also done by Rhythm and Hughes.
What is past?
The interesting thing about this for the kids is that there was actually a portion of the film when they were all shooting together, and then because of the schedule and the way things worked, Skander did actually split off from the others. So there was a long portion where they didn't really see that much of each other, and I remember Georgie saying in particular, a few weeks later, that she just kind of missed having him around. And this scene was when they really did get back together, so I think all the kids were genuinely feeling close to Edmund and happy to be together with Skander again. I think it really comes through in their performance. And Skander actually accepted a hug, so he must have been okay with it.
I think he's still even at the age of, what is he, 14 now? Still will have nothing to do with hugs.
Narnia's not going to run out of toasted.
One of the complexities in a lot of these sequences, and it's sort of one of the unfortunate things about once you start having mythological creatures in your movie, is that it's hard to point the camera anywhere without it becoming a visual effects shot. Any background element, you've got a guy in green tights and suddenly you've got to add furry legs to him. So a lot of these shots just out of necessity became visual effects, and it meant that there was a huge number of visual effects shots in the movie that you just kind of take for granted.
I've seen what the White Witch can do, and I've helped her do it.
This is another scene I contemplated cutting out at one point. It wasn't in the original story, so to speak, and I didn't know if it was essential or not, but it really is the moment that the four children come together and that Edmund really steps up for the first time. So it ended up being vitally important. And there's just this really, a small gesture there, but a lovely moment when Lucy grabs Edmund's hand and shows her support and forgiveness. This next location is Elephant Rocks, which is just across the way from where we were. And I almost put this scene in just so I could shoot there, just because it's such a beautiful location. And, you know, I wanted a bit of levity, a lighter moment, a more fun moment for the kids before they get into this, this next serious moment with the White Witch. And I just thought this was such a beautiful backdrop.
It's also, I think, such a wonderful fantasy for children, both for the girls in terms of archery and the boys just getting to ride horses, and Peter especially on a unicorn.
And that voice was, of course, Philip Stoyer, one of our producers.
Yeah, I noticed you never asked me to do a voice.
Your name's not Philip.
The horse could have been called Mark.
Now we get into some pretty complicated combination work where ILM were doing most of the backgrounds here with the creatures in the background, the extension of the camp and the tents and all the centaurs and fawns and satyrs and cats and so on. Sony Imageworks were doing Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, and Rhythm and Hughes were doing Aslan. So very often we'd have this one shot being passed from facility to facility. Each one would do their little bit and pass it on, and then it would go through that cycle several times to combine it. And it really is a tribute to Randy Starr and Dean Wright, our visual effects, and all of our visual effects team, that we were able to pull this off.
Then you'll remember well that every traitor belongs to me. His blood is my property.
Who did that expressive dog over Edmund's shoulder at one point? At one point, when they find out that he's sounds like he's going to be toast, the poor dog hangs his head and is so sad. It's wonderful.
I was just going to say, it's one of my favorite little sort of side characters.
Yeah.
Jen Embley, who was the animation supervisor at ILM, just really had some fun with him. He gets into the scene, you know, more than anyone else.
You have an animated character who's a ham.
Yes.
It's a very funny moment when Georgie Henley, who plays Lucy, when her father saw the film for the first time, and he saw all these creatures, was kidded with me, and he said, "Wait a minute! You never told me my daughter was going to be acting with leopards and lions and all of these dangerous characters, but they're so convincing." It really did give him a sense of sort of retroactive fear for his daughter.
This whole scene was shot under terrible weather conditions. We would start the day in one weather condition. An hour later, it would be completely different. We had people up on the hill looking through filters, watching for sun, and ended up deciding to shoot this scene overcast and the other one sunny, so that we would have the ability to keep shooting no matter what the weather. But of course the children had to go through a costume change in between the two scenes, and that would sometimes take up to an hour, and by the time we'd sent them off for a costume change, they'd sometimes come back and the weather would have changed back to sunny. So it was really a nightmare, and it was, you know, having to have someone looking and kind of calling out sun in 10 minutes and then getting the kids on their mark, getting everyone prepared emotionally and rolling cameras. And I'm just really surprised and pleased that the emotion of the scene really comes through. And in fact, this little exchange between Aslan and Lucy is really one of my favorite sort of unspoken moments in the film, because you really get the sense that something's going on, something's wrong, and you really get the sense of Lucy's connection with Aslan, that she picks up on that.
The weather wasn't our friend either in the art department. I remember Kerry Brown and Elaine Kosmishko, who looked after all these tents. As they weathered, the colours started to very slightly fade, and we thought, oh no, this is going to be a tragedy. But actually, what it did was to sort of and put them into the landscape, in a more sort of worn and weathered way, and it turned out to be an advantage in the end.